So welcome to week 13's lecture. This week we're going to be covering sugar, the pharmacology of sugar, and a few other things. But the reason I added this one to our syllabus or to our schedule was because in order to really understand addiction, especially if you've never been addicted to any of the drugs that we've already covered, sugar helps, because sugar is also a drug of abuse, as we'll find. And although most people have never abused sugar, I think once you start to understand better what sugar addiction looks like and how we use sugar every day, it becomes easier to understand how addiction to the other drugs that we've covered might be or might feel like once you know what it might be like to use sugar, because everybody's used sugar. So we're going to cover, as we do often, some sources of sugar, the chemistry of sugars, and some epidemiology, nutrition information, a little bit of sugar biochemistry, and then I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Robert Lustig, who has been presenting information about sugar and addiction all over the world for years. He's a complete god on this material. He's a genius. So first off, it was Hippocrates who said that the natural healing force within each one of us is the greatest force to get well. Our food should be our medicine, and our medicine should be our food. And another fun one is this Ayurvedic proverb that's, when diet is wrong, medicine is of no use, and when diet is correct, medicine is of no need. So the natural sources of sugar, at least the sugar that we eat most of the time, are corn with high fructose corn syrup, sugar cane, and sugar beet extracts. All of these produce mostly sucrose. Bees with honey, fruit, and maple syrup, all with varying amounts of fructose and glucose in them, but fructose is the sweet tasting portion of sugar. All of these basically produce sucrose. So when it comes to sugar consumption, of course, early on, like in the early 1800s, sugar was a very expensive product, and so it was a luxury. Not very many people had sugar, and if they did, they didn't have very much. And the amount of sugar produced, the price of sugar has dropped, and thus the amount that people could afford increased, and the ability to put it in products that could still be inexpensive enough for the average person to purchase has increased, and so the amount of sugar that we consume has also increased until about 1920, where it pretty much leveled off until the 1980s, where it once again started to increase, and then since about 1994, I think it has been decreasing a little bit. But this is actually sugar consumption in pounds per year per person, and right now I believe it's around 96. So, and at the peak it was like 115 pounds of sugar, which is incredible. That's amazing. You're almost eating your weight in sugar each year. A number of things have driven the obesity epidemic. Sugar is just one of the things, but also the introduction of high fructose corn syrup may have played a role. Certainly, the increase in advertising of food directly to consumers through television, especially very young consumers, and advertising tremendously sugary products like, well, they've been increasingly sugary. Now you can basically buy small chocolate chip cookies as sugar, or as cereal rather, or you can buy things like sugar pops or whatever. Everything for kids practically is either sugar coated or pure sugar that's been formed and possibly flavored. But it was about here, which is about 1984 or so, when the obesity epidemic really took off in the United States. Of course, this number, the percent of people that are obese, tailed off. Another thing that happened to add to the perfect storm type properties was the introduction of a dramatic increase in the number or the amount of oil that was put in food and consumed by Americans, and this is pounds per person per year of fats. Well, in this case, so obviously the one that has risen dramatically from the 70s, or through the 70s, through the 90s, and now in the late 90s, early 2000s, just through the roof is oils. And you'll see that it is these simple sugars and oils that are the primary components in processed or even ultra-processed foods, and that accounts for this dramatic increase in the amount that is consumed per person. Back in 1980s, actually it was in the 70s, when there was a debate about whether fat or sugar was the primary cause of heart disease, this physician from the UK, John Yudkin, wrote, "If only a small fraction of what is already known about the effects of sugar were to be revealed in relation to any other material used as a food additive, that material would promptly be banned." And he wrote that back in the 70s as part of his book, Pure, White, and Deadly, How Sugar is Killing Us and What We Can Do to Stop It, that he published in 1972. But the establishment, along with the food industry and the sugar producers, went with the hypothesis that fat and cholesterol were the cause of heart disease, and thus introduced dietary guidelines recommending the reduction in fat in our diet and basically no restriction on carbohydrates. So as things were made low fat, usually the amount of sugar in them was increased 2 to 4 times the amount of sugar before, and most of that, of course, was just added from sugar sources like high fructose corn syrup, sugar cane, or beet sugar.
All of us are now have insulin levels 3 times higher than we used to. And the question, of course, is, where did that come from? Who here in the audience has diabetes? Anybody? It must be a few of you, because diabetes is a pretty big problem here. Okay? Here's the problem. 7/8 of you, 7/8 of the people with diabetes don't even know they have it. You are blind to diabetes until you become blind from diabetes. So you don't even know you have a problem yet. So here's the way to look at this. Here's the American population, 30% obese, 70% normal weight. And the standard mantra is, it's the obese person's fault, because 80% of those obese people are sick. They have type 2 diabetes. They have hyperlipidemia. They have cardiovascular disease. They have hypertension. They have cancer. They have dementia. And they are breaking the bank. Those 80%, those 57 million people, if we could just get them to diet and exercise, we could solve this problem. That's the standard mantra. This is incorrect, because 20% of those obese people are actually metabolically healthy. They will live a completely normal life, die at a completely normal age, not cost the taxpayer a dime. They're just fat. Conversely, up to 40% of the normal weight population have the exact same diseases. They get type 2 diabetes, they get hypertension, they get dyslipidemia, they get cardiovascular disease. And you know what? They don't even know they have a problem. When you add them up, it's more than half the US population. In other words, this is a public health crisis. Here's an example of how that works. Here are 2 people equal weight. One's healthy, one's sick. You want to take a guess which one the sick one is? Can you tell? I can tell. The one on the bottom is sick. Why? The guy on the top, he's just got big love handles. The guy on the bottom, he's got fat all around his organs. And that is what's making him sick. And this is called TOFI, T-O-F-I. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside. Okay? And I venture to guess there are a few TOFIs in the room right now, and you think you are just fine. And you are not.
So I actually went through and did a calculation back in, I believe it was 2018, maybe 2017, whatever, regarding how much disease could be attributed to added sugar, and specifically how many people were being killed. So, as I mentioned, in the 60s, this concept was actually debated, and finally now we've uncovered enough information to make these initial estimates at the population level effects. And as of 2016, added sugar accounted for 291,000 deaths. So compared to the drug overdose epidemic, we've got that down here, alcohol-related deaths, and then you've got sugar-related deaths at, well, almost 3 times the number that are killed by alcohol, and more like 4 or 5 times the number that die from drug overdoses, and about 2/3 of the number that die from smoking-related illness. And actually, there was a paper that came out last year in the Lancet journal, which is a medical journal in the United Kingdom, and it stated that worldwide, poor diet, specifically added sugar and ultra-processed food, account for more deaths worldwide than smoking. So we'll get in a little bit of information about plants. Obviously, through photosynthesis, they take CO2 and put it together into a glucose molecule, and that molecule is then goes to the production of either amino acids with some nitrates from the soil, to sucrose, which is the sugar that we extract from corn, sugar beets, or sugar cane. Some of that is then further processed in the plant to form fats or oils. Some of it is stored in the plant as starch, which is very common in tubers like potatoes, which are almost entirely starch, and there's quite a bit of starch in carrots. Cellulose is the tough, fibrous stuff that, obviously make trees, but also makes the stalks for wheat plants that we do not eat, and makes a lot of roughage, basically. Also, glucose can be used to make nucleic acids, and then at night, through the respiratory process, it actually releases energy and releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So this is what happens when you consume proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, vitamins, or fiber. Generally, all of these proteins, carbs, nucleic acids, and lipids are enzymatically broken down in your stomach and small intestine, and the proteins aren't absorbed as whole proteins, they're absorbed as amino acids. And the carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharides, which are individual sugar molecules, and then those are absorbed. Nucleic acids are broken often down into the nucleic bases and the nucleic sugars, along with phosphate. And the lipids are broken down into glycerols and free fatty acids and cholesterol, and those are, the glycerol, of course, is absorbed through the bloodstream. The fatty acids, cholesterol, and monoacyl glycerol are absorbed through the lymphatic system, eventually into the blood, and also goes to the liver. The fiber just helps keep things moving through you. So in your intestine, there's that brush border that we were talking about that helps you to absorb things. So glucose is moved through the cell membrane or through this border using this GLUT2 molecule. It also can be moved into the cell by this SGLT1, and fructose along with a glucose molecule can enter using the GLUT2. The GLUT5 can also move fructose all by itself, and then on the other side into the lymph and the bloodstream, you have transporters that move glucose and fructose. Once the sugar is absorbed, it goes into the bloodstream. Red blood cells utilize it, the brain utilizes it, muscles can store it as glycogen or utilize it directly. Adipose tissue, under the direction of insulin, can store the sugar in the form of fat, and the liver can either produce glycogen to store the sugar, or it can produce fats for more long-term storage. So when it comes to glucose as a fuel, red blood cells only run on glucose. Your brain prefers glucose, but can also run on ketone bodies. Your liver prefers glucose, muscles prefer glucose, and your fat cells prefer glucose. But liver, muscle, and fat can all run on fatty acids. So the first choice fuel for all organs is glucose. And glucose is the only fuel for red blood cells, so you need a constant supply. And the fate of glucose in your metabolism, anyway, is that you take one glucose molecule, and through all of this biochemistry, you end up producing 38 ATP, along with 6 CO2s and 6 waters. That's an amazing piece of machinery there. you can take a 6-carbon glucose along with some oxygen and produce that much energy, 38 ATP. And you can see here that actually in the cell itself, in the cytosol, you only produce 4 ATP. It's here in the oxidative phosphorylation that goes on in your mitochondria, which are your little batteries inside each cell, that you produce 34 of those ATP. So without the mitochondria, your cells run out of energy really quick. So when it comes to carbohydrates, they are divided into simple carbs and complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are either monosaccharides or disaccharides. Monosaccharides are individual sugars. Disaccharides are made up of 2 sugars. And polysaccharides are polymers made out of sugars. So the simple sugars are glucose, mannose, galactose, and fructose. The 2 that we're going to spend the most time on are glucose and fructose. So this is a 6-member ring, and this is a 5-member ring. And although they're referred to as sugars because of the placement of the oxygen in the ring here, they're all alcohols because each one of them has at least one, if not like 4 or 5 OH residues. Like ribose and deoxyribose are used to generate RNA and DNA. Glucose, of course, is the most common fuel, and then there's all these others. You don't have to worry about them too much, but fructose, you can note that it is a actual ketone sugar. Another interesting factoid is that, of course, monosaccharides, especially glucose, is the energy currency of life. So it's how energy is transferred between plants and animals, how it's transferred between a lot of different organisms, like bacteria often utilize sugars as their energy source as well. But in humans, sugar, any sugar, is not an essential nutrient. Even though it's used preferentially by every organ, it's not essential. In fact, we have machinery in both the liver and the muscles that can release glucose from glycogen stores, and when absolutely necessary, your body will make glucose from other things like fatty acids and amino acids when you either haven't eaten enough or haven't eaten any. So you can live on things like fats or amino acids, although it's certainly not recommended. You can do it, and your body will make the glucose that it needs. So these are the slightly more complex disaccharides made of 2 sugar molecules. Sucrose is the one that's most common part of our diet. Maltose is produced by cereals, and lactose is the most common sugar in milk. So here you have a fructose molecule plus a glucose molecule makes sucrose, and that's the one that comes from sugar beets and sugar cane. Then you have 2 glucose molecules that go together to make maltose, which is rapidly cleaved into 2 glucose molecules once you consume it, and then lactose, which is a galactose and a glucose molecule put together, and that's in cow's milk and mommy's milk. So the polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Plants make cellulose because of this alternating nature of the sugars and how they're rotated. This is something that cannot be easily cut up into individual sugars by your digestive tract. In fact, the only things that can consume this stuff and get energy from it, well, not the only, but one of the only, are termites. And that's because not that termites make the proper enzyme. There's actually a bacteria in the gut of termites that makes the proper enzyme to cut this up into glucose molecules. What we make in our liver and our muscles is glycogen, which is the uniform sugar bond, and it's also highly branched, which makes it much easier to rapidly cut up into individual glucose molecules, because at the end of each one of these branches you can have an enzyme that's coming along and chopping off a glucose molecule. So that's why this is highly branched. Ingenious design. And then of course in things like potatoes there's starch, which is moderately branched, but it's branched enough that you can easily, and of course it's that same bond you can easily cut, and you can actually turn white bread, which is starch, or French fries, white potato, into individual glucose faster than you can eating pure sucrose. So if you take a teaspoon of table sugar and eat that, or you eat 3 French fries, you'll get sugar faster out of the French fries than you will the teaspoon of table sugar, which is crazy, but it's true.
I would like to just refer back to the front slide for a minute. Because as I was looking at it, I thought to myself, yeah, this one. Indeed, your brain is broccoli. And so is ours across the way. And I can prove it to you. You have Brexit and we have Trump. And it's being hacked. It's really easy to hack broccoli, isn't it? Almost there. There we go. So today I'm going to try to answer 3 questions for you. The first, what's the relation between addiction, depression, and health, since all 3 of them seem to be in force today, upping addiction and depression, downing in health. Second question, what is the difference between pleasure and happiness, which I actually think is at the root of the whole addiction, depression, and health problem. And lastly, something perhaps a little bit off the beaten path, but very related to this question of being hacked. What is the difference between marketing and propaganda? And I want you to be thinking about those 3 questions as the lecture progresses on. And by the end, I hope we will have answered all 3, and in doing so, we will have provided a, shall we say, a new paradigm for both you as individuals, for the NHS, for the UK, and for the US to try to move forward past these problems. So let's start with health. I'm sure you know we are not healthy. And it's not like the UK is any healthier than we are, but I just wanted to show you very specifically that we in the United States have actually now experienced, for the first time in our history, 3 years in a row of declining lifespan. Never happened before. Likely to happen again, unfortunately, because we have not fixed the problem. We haven't even come close to fixing the problem. Now, you may or may not know who this gentleman is. His name is Ezekiel Emanuel. He is Rahm Emanuel's brother. Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff to President Obama. Ezekiel is a pediatric oncologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was also architect of this thing called the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And he was charged with selling this issue to the American public. And he wrote this article in The Atlantic back in 2014, Why I Hope to Die at 75. Now, I don't know about you, but I got a real problem with that, because I'm 62 now, and 75 is coming real fast, and I really don't want to die at 75. In fact, I really want to be healthy and functional and, writing books and, trying to do research, till through my 90s, and presumably you do too. The point was that he had to justify why half of healthcare is spent in the last year of life, and that year is not particularly productive. Basically, what he was arguing for was for this thing that Sarah Palin once called death panels. And in fact, it is kind of built into Obamacare. So this is a problem, trying to sell that. And the question is, we passed it. It's still there, kind of, sort of. You've probably heard about it in the news. The question is, did it deliver? And the answer is, well, we've been able to deliver 32 million sick people onto the rolls. You here have the NHS. We have private insurance. We have been able to get 32 million people onto the rolls. But the question is, how do you pay for such a thing? Now, Obama said we could pay for it by providing preventative services. That is, by being able to see your doctor, by being able to access healthcare, access medication. We will keep people out of the emergency room where costs are 50 to 100 times higher. So ultimately, it would pay for itself. So we get cartoons like this. The government can't make me buy health insurance, and why would I when I can just go here and you'll pay for it? And in fact, that's exactly what happened, because as you may or may not be aware, the Supreme Court struck down what was known as the individual mandate. That is, you don't have to buy health insurance. Well, if you don't have to buy health insurance, then people go bare. And when people go bare, then what happens when they do get sick? Well, in fact, after the Affordable Care Act went into effect, we actually saw an uptick in ER visits. So much so that healthcare plans had to increase their costs by 25%, and three of the major insurers in the United States opted out of Obamacare, United, Aetna, and Humana. Now, if you think it's working, then why in the world would 3 major health insurers say, sorry, we're not playing? So clearly a problem. And here's the reason for the problem. The problem is because it costs too much. And you know this, because it costs too much here as well, and I will show you the data. So in 2012, it was $245 billion just for diabetes alone, $345 billion just 4 years later, despite all the efforts to try to control the diabetes epidemic. When you do the math, that's $10,000 per diabetic, considering we have a 9.4% prevalence of diabetes in the United States. That's a big number. Trump said, well, we're going to roll back Obamacare, and we're going to repeal and replace, and we're going to put something better. Of course, there is nothing better because there's nothing better because there is nothing. And he said, well, you know, diabetes, you brought it on yourself, so no health care for you. The fact of the matter is, it's not like the UK has done a whole lot better, because here's the data for here. 17 billion pounds for 4.5 million diabetics. So that works out to 4,000 pounds per diabetic. So equivalent of about $6,000 to $7,000 per diabetic. We have 10,000. So you're not far behind us. It's not like you're doing a whole lot better. And in fact, you are unlikely to get better because you have not solved the problem. You have not addressed the issue. And the issue is what we are talking about today. Ultimately, you, we, and the entire developed and developing world have to come to grips with 2 relatively inconvenient truths. They are, number 1, there is no medicalized prevention for chronic metabolic disease like diabetes, like heart disease, like cancer, like dementia, like fatty liver disease, like polycystic ovarian disease, like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which currently costs 75% of all healthcare dollars. There is no medicalized prevention. There's no pill for this. There's just long-term treatment, but the treatment isn't really treatment because it's treatment for the symptoms of disease, not the disease itself. The second inconvenient truth is you cannot fix healthcare until you fix health. You cannot fix health until you fix diet. And you cannot fix diet until you know what the hell is wrong. And we have not addressed what is wrong at all. In fact, we've actually buried our heads in the sand. And things continue to get worse, as Patrick already demonstrated to you. So in order to fix the future, you have to understand the past. You have to understand how we got to where we are today. Starts here. Everybody remember this? I know it's American, but I think it was here in the UK too. Okay? And now the bad news. And now, and 17 years later, we had this instead. And this says 6 million kids are seriously overweight. And here we are 17 years later after this, or 18 years later now, and it's only quadrupled. 24 million kids seriously overweight, and most with metabolic dysfunction, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, etc., which I had to take care of. Right? This is perhaps the biggest piece of propaganda of all. Okay? And in America, this was a very big deal. You can watch this YouTube video. It's a 2-minute video. Don't do it right now. Okay? But it's called Coming Together, sponsored by the Coca-Cola Company, and it was on every American football game in the year 2013. And this is a direct quote from that video. Beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. So, you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or you can get your calories from kumquats. Doesn't matter. If you eat more than you burn, you will gain weight. If you eat less than you burn, you will lose weight. Therefore, it is about energy balance. Heard that before? It's about calories in and calories out. Therefore, it's about 2 behaviors, gluttony and sloth. Therefore, it's about diet and exercise. Therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault. Therefore, any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. Therefore, don't pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. All of those come from this simple, quote, common sense assessment that all calories are the same, that a calorie is a calorie. And after all, it's common sense. Well, I don't believe in common sense. I believe in science. I believe in data. Perhaps you do too. Because the science says something else entirely. What the science says is that a calorie is not a calorie. That where those calories come from determine where they go in the body. And when you actually look at the nutritional biochemistry of individual calories, it makes it very clear what the actual problem is. But as long as you're just interested in whether or not the output from a heat standpoint, because that's what calories are a measure of, is the same, you will never see the answer. And who is it that is saying that? Well, here they are right here in the middle. These are your 10 conglomerates that control 90% of the food in the US and in the UK today. Okay? So you can go to Tesco, you can go to Sainsbury, you can go to M&S, doesn't matter. All these guys, they're all the same. In fact, we have data that shows that these foods promoted by these 10 conglomerates are in fact the problem. So here is a study that was performed by a group here in the UK, looking at the 19 European countries, and there's the UK up there, looking at how much ultra-processed foods, the foods that those 10 conglomerates make, against the prevalence of obesity. And there you are. They call UK the fat man of Europe. Well, there you are right there. Okay. The same is true in the adjusted model. And you can see right here, down here at the UK, prevalence of obesity, highest of the entire European Union. In the United States, this is what drives processed food consumption. Because processed food doesn't taste very good unless you add something to it that does. And that something is sugar. So with the growth of the sugar industry in the United States in the 19th century, so Domino, C&H, Texas, Louisiana, Hawaii, and around the world, like Curacao and Barbados, et cetera. That was your sugar island, was Barbados. Okay? We reached a stabilization where cost equaled demand here prior to World War II. Here's rationing of World War II. And here's the advent of processed food here, and the substitution of high fructose corn syrup for sucrose because it was cheaper in the United States. We're going to come back to, actually, I'll take that. I'm going to now lay on top of this another graph that shows the percent of gross domestic product spent on healthcare in the United States for the same period of time. What do you see? Same thing. When processed food entered our lexicon in 1965, that's when healthcare costs started to rise. And that was true in the NHS, that's true in the United States, that's true basically in all developed countries. Here we have life expectancy against health expenditure. And we're looking over time, and these are the various curves, mostly of the European Union. Here's the UK, and here's the United States here. We spend more for less life expectancy than anyone else, by far. But it's not like you guys are doing particularly well out there. These guys are doing much better than you. So let me just explain to you how come this is such a big problem. It's called money. So, in the United States, the food industry grosses $1.46 trillion a year. And of that, $657 billion, or 45%, is gross profit. A gross profit margin of 45%. The next highest industry after that is pharma at 18%. 45%, 18%. Everybody got it? And we call them drug whores. So what does that make the food industry at 45%? There's a lot of money riding on this. Understand that tobacco, as bad as tobacco is, and it is, it was only a $56 billion industry at its worst. This is $1.46 trillion, 20 times higher. So we're talking about a whole lot of money. Now, in the United States, healthcare totals $3.5 trillion a year. Of that, 75% is chronic metabolic disease, the diseases I mentioned. And of that, 75% of that could be prevented if we could go back to rates of 1970 before processed food took over our entire lives. Everybody got that? So, if you do the math, 70% of 75% of 75% of 3.5 trillion is $1.9 trillion a year going down a rat hole in the United States. Same for the UK. You get the idea. This is where your NHS dollars are going, is for the care of metabolic disease due to processed food. We lose triple what the food industry makes, and that is just unsustainable. You can't keep doing that. And that is why, in America, Medicare will be broke by 2026. Obamacare can't fix it, Trump care can't fix it, Bernie Sanders' Medicare for all can't fix it, and guess what? The NHS can't fix it either. In fact, no one can fix it. It is unfixable because the food caused it. The only thing that will fix it is fixing the food. period. There is no drug for this. There is no pill for this. When you actually look at the 6 pathways in the cell that are dysfunctional, that lead to cell aging and death, and I'll name them for you: glycation, oxidative stress, inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, and membrane instability. Those are the 6 things that kill you. Not one of them is druggable. They're foodable, but they're not druggable. And so that's why there is no pill that will ever fix this. Only the food. And right now, we have the food that causes it, not the food that fixes it. I could stop talking now. I think you get the picture. But we'll keep going. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks this. You know, there are a lot of doctors out there, and they all have different ideas about what's going on. But you know what? When you really want to know the real story, who do you ask? Ask the banks. You know why? Why should you ask the banks? Because they are absolutely, completely, totally, 100% transparent. They have only one goal: make money. That is their goal: make money. They'll make as much money as they can, so they will not be taken in by any bias or by any propaganda. They will actually look at the data themselves because they want to be ahead of any trends, and they also don't want to be taken in by any propaganda. And so, an international investment bank, Credit Suisse, came out with these 2 reports, this one in 2013, this one in 2016, and I'm going to read you 2 quotes from each of these reports. The first one, Fat, the New Health Paradigm. And here's what it says on page 22. A high intake of omega-6 fats, vegetable oils, has not been proven as beneficial for our health, and trans fats have been shown to have negative health effects. The higher rate of vegetable oils and the increase in carbohydrate consumption in the last 30 to 40 years are the 2 leading factors behind the high rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome in the United States. Saturated and monounsaturated fats are not. Completely agree. 100%. They got it absolutely right. Vegetable oils and carbohydrate consumption. So where do you find vegetable oils and carbohydrates? Processed food. That's practically the definition of processed food. Duh. This is not rocket science. And how about this one? Sugar consumption at a crossroads. Remember, this is a global investment bank. One point that we find interesting, however, is that there are no studies that have been published to our knowledge that suggest sugar has a protective benefit, while there are a number of studies, including the Basu study, which is ours, by the way, that at least partially implicate sugar. If sugar truly had no specific impact on the body when considered in isolation from other factors, one would assume that random chance would lead to some studies showing sugar to be beneficial, while others would show harmful effects, and still others would show no effects. In other words, you'd have a splay around the mean. Some saying beneficial, some saying not. But there are none that say anything remotely close to beneficial. In fact, we have now demonstrated exactly why sugar is a primary, if not the primary driver of chronic metabolic disease. What we did, these are 3 papers, we now have a 4th, and I will describe it for you in just a second. What we did was we took 43 children with metabolic syndrome from our obesity clinic that I took care of at UCSF. So, obesity plus at least one other comorbidity. Latino and African American, so low socioeconomic status. All high processed food consumers, because that's what you can get on WIC and SNAP, the governmental nutrition supplementation programs. And what we did was we figured out what these kids were eating on their baseline diets at home. We studied them on that baseline diet. And then for the next 9 days, we catered their meals. No added sugar. We took their percent consumption of sugar from 28% of calories to 10% of calories. 28 to 10. We gave them fruit. That was where they got their sugar from. We gave them fruit. But that was it. Every other food that had added sugar was removed. Now, if you do that, you're going to remove 350 to 400 calories a day out of their diet. In which case, after 10 days, they might lose weight. We didn't want them to lose weight, because if they lost weight and they got better, people would say, well, of course, they got better, they lost weight. We wanted weight to not be a confounder. So we had to give them back the 350 to 400 calories per day that they were missing in sugar as something else that was equivalent. We gave them starch. We gave them refined starch. Everybody with me? So in the vernacular, we took the pastries out, we put the bagels in. We took the sweetened yogurt out, we put the baked potato chips in. We took the chicken teriyaki out, we put the turkey hot dogs in. So we didn't give them good food, we gave them crappy food. We gave them processed food. We gave them kid food. Food kids would eat, but it was no added sugar food. High starch, low sugar, but all processed. Stuff you buy at Tesco, stuff you buy at Sainsbury's. Okay, we're not talking about fancy food here. We're talking about junk food, just no added sugar food. And we gave them a scale. And every day we'd call them up on the phone. What'd you weigh? And if they were losing weight, eat more! The goal was to keep their weight constant over the course of the 10 days. And then we restudied them again 10 days later. Everybody with me? That's what we did. These 3 papers plus now a 4th in Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism as of 2 weeks ago. And in cartoon form, let me show you what we found. What we found was these kids had fatty livers. They had liver fat. That's why this is kind of brownish, like foie gras. And what we found was that they were putting out a lot of triglyceride, and there was a lot of fat in the liver, and that was put primarily as VLDL, very low density lipoproteins, at serum triglyceride in the blood at baseline. And then after 9 days of isocaloric fructose restriction, that is the sweet molecule in sugar. So we did a glucose for fructose exchange, because starch is glucose and sugar is glucose fructose. So we took the glucose fructose out and put the glucose in. So all we did was get the fructose out. Everybody got the idea? That's what we did. This one sweet molecule of sugar. 22% reduction in liver fat. The de novo lipogenesis, the turning sugar into fat, got cut in half. The triglycerides went down by 46%. And most importantly, their pancreases started making insulin properly. And we reversed their metabolic syndrome, all in 10 days, with no change in calories and no change in weight. And the 4th paper, the one that just came out 2 weeks ago, actually found the toxic metabolite in the liver, which is a metabolite of fructose that is very specific. It is called methylglyoxal. And what it does is it damages proteins in the liver cell, which drive the cell to make extra fat and cause insulin resistance. And when you take the sugar out, the methylglyoxal goes away and the liver gets better. So we now have the toxic metabolite that drives this process, and we are very excited about it. So, my colleagues, some here in the UK, including Asim Malhotra, whom you've probably heard of, published this editorial a couple of 2 years ago. The cholesterol and calorie hypotheses are both dead. It is time to focus on the real culprit, insulin resistance. Because if you talk about calories, you can't win. Because calories are not the problem. They never were. And everyone who talks about calories is either a fool or a liar. And I say it right now. And if there are any dietitians in the room, we can have that discussion outside and we can take you to the woodshed if you need to. Okay? You need to get with the program. This is not about calories, and it never was. It's about nutritional biochemistry. It's not about math, it's about science. Get it right. We also published this last year. The science against sugar alone is insufficient in tackling the obesity and type 2 diabetes crises. We must also overcome opposition from vested interests. And I will list some of those vested interests for you. Here's one of the vested interests and what they did. The Sugar Research Foundation, SRF. My colleagues at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, and Stan Glantz, Stan is Mr. Anti-Tobacco, found the paper trail from the Sugar Research Foundation to the Harvard School of Public Health back in 1965, where the Sugar Research Foundation paid the Harvard School of Public Health, the chairman of the department, Fred Stair, and his associate, Mark Hegsted, who became the head of the US Department of Agriculture, the equivalent of $50,000 to publish 2 reports in the New England Journal of Medicine, which singled out fat and cholesterol as the dietary cause of coronary disease and downplayed evidence that sucrose, sugar consumption, was also a risk factor. The SRF set the review's objective, contributed articles for inclusion, and received drafts. The SRF's funding and role was not disclosed. This has been a put-up job from the very beginning. You've been hacked. All of you. Me too, for a while. But we found the data. We found the paper trail. We found the crime. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, Credit Suisse, a bank, is not the only one who says there's a problem. This is from Morgan Stanley, another global investment bank. And what they did was they modeled out for the next 20 years what economic growth would look like based on a low sugar case here in blue or a high sugar case here in gold, which is what we have right now. And you'll notice for the high sugar case, economic productivity reaches 0.0%. Now, who is that good for? Is that even good for the food industry? At some point, everyone will revolt. The question is when? What has to happen to get people to start voting with their votes instead of letting companies vote with their dollars or pounds. And ultimately, this is what we are trying to deal with. Big Food's poisonous propaganda. And I will explain to you the difference between marketing and propaganda at the end of the talk. So, that's the health part. What about the mental health part? Why we're here today. What's going on in the brain? I told you what's going on in the liver. What's going on in the brain? Well, let's start with addiction. So, this is interesting. Junk food addiction may be clue to obesity. Binging on high-calorie foods may be as addictive as cocaine or nicotine and could cause compulsive eating and obesity, according to a study published on Sunday that was in Nature Neuroscience. Okay. So who here believes that food is addictive? Who here believes all food is addictive? Who here believes specific foods are addictive? Who here believes that how can something be addictive when it's necessary for survival? It's okay, you can raise your hand, it's okay. This is audience participation. Should give you one of those clickers. The fact of the matter is, this concept of food addiction has been around for a while, but it has been sort of battered up a lot. We have to discuss it in order to be able to understand what we're really talking about. So, Mark Gold, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Florida, had actually published several papers back in as early as 2009 on this concept of food addiction. Yet, in 2012, when he published his textbook, he changed it from food addiction to food and addiction. And the reason was because there was a lot of controversy. And here was part of the controversy, and it came right here from Adamsbrook up in Cambridge, from Ziauddin and Faruqi and Fletcher. And they said, obesity and the brain, how convincing is the addiction model? And what they argued in this article was that how can something that's necessary for survival be addictive? Because after all, you have to survive. This led my colleagues over on the other side of the pond, Nicole Adina and Mark Potenza from Yale, to write, tossing the baby out with the bath water after a brief rinse, the potential downside of dismissing food addiction based on limited data. To which the Adamsbrook group then wrote, food addiction, is there a baby in the bath water? So as you can see, this is a relatively hot button issue, to say the least. So we have to look at the data a little bit more carefully, and we have to actually know what we're talking about in order to make the argument. And that's what we're going to do right now. So this group at Adamsbrook is part of a larger European group known as Neurofast. And Neurofast published this editorial or review in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. And here's what they said. Yes, there is something called eating addiction, but it is not food addiction. Now, does it matter? Is that just semantic? And the answer is no, that's not semantic at all. It matters. And the reason is because eating addiction puts the onus on the individual. You have the problem. Whereas food addiction puts the onus on the food. The food has the problem. Because if it's food addiction, then the industry has a responsibility. If it's eating addiction, the industry has no responsibility. So this is not a semantic argument. This actually matters. The question is, what's the data? So here's what Neurofast says. This is from their website. They said, current evidence does not allow us to conclude that a single food substance via specific neurobiological mechanism can cause people to overeat and develop obesity. In humans, there is no evidence that a specific food ingredient, or food additive causes a substance-based type of addiction. And then they say the only currently known exception is caffeine. Now that's interesting. They give caffeine a pass. Caffeine is part of food, right? And if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. So how come caffeine gets a pass? Then they go on and say, within this context, we specifically point out that we do not consider alcoholic beverages as food, despite the fact that 1 gram of alcohol has an energy density of 7 kcal. So they have given both caffeine and alcohol a pass, even though both are in food. In fact, fruit has alcohol by itself. Have you ever seen these, drunk bears, in the woods during, in autumn? Because the yeast gets into the berries, ferments it to alcohol. The bears eat the berries, and that's actually when they're most dangerous because they're drunk. So if it's about obesity, if it's about eating addiction, that is individual problem. If there's no specific foodstuff that's addictive, then the food industry says, not my problem. And they have carte blanche. And that means there's no option for any sort of societal intervention because they can go do what the hell they want. So this matters a lot. This is a huge, huge issue. So the question is, are they right? So could there be a food or a food additive or something in food that actually causes addiction? Remember, once upon a time, we had this thing called Coca-Cola. Anybody know the story of Coca-Cola? The real story? Not the sunny sunshine story, but the real story. Do I have a minute? You want to know the real story of Coca-Cola? 1886, Atlanta pharmacist by the name of John Pemberton invents the formula which would later become Coca-Cola. Why did John Pemberton develop this formula? What was he doing? Turns out John Pemberton was in the Civil War, and in 1865 he was wounded, and he got his first dose of morphine, and then his second dose, and his third dose, and he ended up becoming a morphine addict, which is why he became a pharmacist. So he had easy access to morphine. The problem was, over the next 20 years, his entire economy, his livelihood, his health went down the tubes because of his morphine addiction. Now, John Pemberton was a smart guy, and he knew he had to get off morphine, but he didn't know how. And so he spent several years trying to concoct some antidote to morphine addiction. And in 1886, he developed a formula where he added the following 4 substances together: cocaine, alcohol, sugar, and caffeine. And at that time, carbonated water was thought to have its own health-promoting properties, and the only place you could do that was with the pressurized jets was in a pharmacy, thus the soda fountain. And so he combined these 4 compounds with carbonated water and developed this thing, which he then sold as Coca-Cola. Guess what? Didn't work. He never did get off his morphine addiction. And in 1888, totally penniless, he sold the formula to an Atlanta businessman by the name of Asa Candler for $2,500. And 6 weeks later, John Pemberton was dead of a morphine overdose. That is the real story of Coca-Cola. Now, as it turns out, in 1903, when Candler tried to go interstate, the precursor to the FDA said, well, you've got cocaine and alcohol in here, and we will not let you ship those over state lines. So he had to take those out. So the question was sugar and caffeine good enough to maintain addiction? And the answer is, oh yeah. Oh yeah. And now, of course, it is in 208 of 209 countries. Soon to be 209 after Trump gets done with North Korea. A little fun fact. So, we need to look at whether or not sugar, because I think sugar is the bad guy in this story, is addictive. So how are we going to do that? Well, we have to look at how it might be similar to other drugs of dependence. The one I think is most appropriate is alcohol, and I'll show you why. We published this paper a couple of years ago, Is Fast Food Addictive? Trying to piece out the different pieces of fast food in order to answer that question. You may have seen this paper, this book, sometime in the recent past from Michael Moss, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for the New York Times. He wrote, Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us. He screwed up. He missed one. What did he miss? What else is in fast food? Caffeine. Okay, now it's fast food. So here are 4 primary items to look at. Let's go one by one. Start with salt. Is salt addictive? Yes or no? What do you think? Got a lot of people saying yes. The answer is no. It is not. It increases the salience of food. It increases habituation, but in and of itself, it is not addictive. Because it turns out we have a lower threshold that's physiologically fixed. You can get people off salt. For instance, the DASH diet will do it. And as a pediatric endocrinologist, I have to take care of children who have a disease called salt-losing congenital adrenal hyperplasia. They do not make the adrenal hormone that holds onto salt called aldosterone. So they are salt cravers. They will drink the pickle juice right out of the pickle jar. Yet, when you treat them with the appropriate aldosterone-like substance called Florinef, a drug called Florinef, their salt craving goes away. So it wouldn't go away if it were addictive. So salt, nope, not addictive. Habituating, not addictive. How about fat? Is fat addictive? Turns out rodents love fat. They love pizza. Did you ever see that YouTube video about the New York City rodent, in the subway system with the whole slice of pizza? It's hysterical. I mean, watch that later too. Okay. The fact of the matter is there are plenty of people on the Atkins diet, there are plenty of people on the low-carb diet, and they do not show any signs of dependence. In fact, energy density is much more closely associated than is fat itself. In fact, people on the ketogenic diet eat much less. Fat, again, habituating, not addictive. Unless you add it with sugar, then it's called a Cinnabon, and that's addictive. How about caffeine? Now, caffeine is a model drug of dependence. Caffeine is like the ultimate in addictiveness. Okay? The good news is it's not toxic. Okay? Unless you have a cardiac arrhythmia, or unless you mix it with alcohol, then you have something called Four Loko, and that is banned in the United States. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, it is definitely addictive and has all the criteria, meets all the criteria for addiction. So caffeine, that's definitely addictive. Which leaves us lastly to sugar. So that's the question. Is sugar, and particularly the molecule fructose, that sweet molecule of sugar, the one that we crave, the one that we savor, the one that makes us put it in everything, is that addictive? Yes or no? So, NeuroFast says sugar, not addictive. I'm going to show you a 20-second video clip, and you will recognize who this is immediately. And I just want you to hear what he has to say, okay, on the subject.
I couldn't get through a day without doing something to alter my consciousness.
And it started with heroin.
It started with sugar. Sugar, oh yeah, when I was 5, 6 years old, I was cramming sugar down my throat as fast as I could get it down. Sweets, you know, sugar on bread and butter. I became addicted to sugar because it changed the way I felt.
So, Eric Clapton talking about heroin, except really not talking about sugar when he was 5 or 6 years old. Sugar is a gateway drug. It's not funny, because that's exactly what's happening to children today. And I'm not even the one who says it. This is from National Geographic, Why We Can't Resist It. So can I prove that sugar is addictive? Anybody know what this is? Anybody work in a neonatal intensive care unit or a newborn nursery? Anybody recognize this at all? This is called Sweeties. Sweeties. It is a super concentrated sucrose solution that you dip the pacifier in and then stick in the newborn boy's mouth before the circumcision. The Jews have wine, everyone else has Sweeties. Wonder why? Maybe because it releases opioids within the brain in the same way. In fact, we have actually shown the metabolic, the hedonic, and the societal parallels with alcohol. And it makes sense that that would be the case when you look at how sugar is metabolized in the liver. So this is a liver cell, a hepatocyte. Here's glucose entering the liver cell, and pretty much all of it ends up going to glycogen, liver starch, not a problem. Pretty safe thing. But here's what happens when you give it alcohol instead. Pretty much all of it ends up in the liver. It does not go to glycogen. What happens is it forms reactive oxygen species, which cause liver damage. Some of it will come down to the mitochondria here as acetate, enter the mitochondria, overwhelm the mitochondria's capabilities. That will then get shuttled out as citrate. That citrate will then end up undergoing this process here in orange, which is called de novo lipogenesis, new fat making. This is how you turn alcohol into fat in order to make fatty liver disease. And there's your lipid droplet, or it will come out as triglyceride, in which case it's a substrate for obesity or for heart disease. So, alcohol causes liver damage, heart disease, etc. What about fructose? Turns out, you see glycogen anywhere? What you see instead is that fructose, 100% of a fructose load enters the liver, comes down here to fructose 1-phosphate, will end up in the mitochondria, do the same thing, end up as VLDL, end up either causing high triglycerides, which can again be a substrate for obesity, or atherosclerosis, or will precipitate out as a lipid droplet, will also cause inflammation, that's your cirrhosis, will also generate hepatic insulin resistance, will also generate hypertension, and will generate hyperglycemia. So there we go. Diabetes, inflammation, fatty liver disease, lipid problems, insulin resistance, obesity, metabolic syndrome. We have the data, and we showed you on the previous, in the health section, on how when we take the sugar out of kids' diets, we reverse their metabolic syndrome. In addition, there's effects on the brain. So the question is, what makes a milkshake so rewarding? Why do we love it so much? And the answer is, we have functional MRI data to show what happens in the brain. There's an area of the brain known as the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, and it's the same reward center for cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, heroin, name your substance or name your behavior. Okay, shopping, gambling, internet, social media, pornography. It's the same reward center for all of them. And it turns out sugar, that fructose molecule, activates that same reward center the same way that alcohol does. And that's been shown in several studies, the one previous and now this one also, showing that it's specific to that fructose molecule. The glucose molecule lights up the cortex. The fructose molecule lights up the limbic system, including that reward center. So it's not just any old carbohydrate, it's specifically sugar. And this is just another one looking at the same thing and showing that obese adolescents have it way worse because their nucleus accumbens is already fried. They're already not transducing it, which is why they need more to get less. And that's the hallmark of addiction, tolerance, needing more to get less. Okay, that's addiction. What about depression? So, as Patrick told you before, depression in children is now a big thing, isn't it? Here are the data. It turns out that children are actually more susceptible to every neurobehavioral disorder, not just depression. They're impulse control, substance use, anxiety, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and they all tend to focus in here around puberty time. And there's reasons for that having to do with how the brain develops and what parts of the brain are involved in suppressing specific behaviors, particularly this area of the brain right here called the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. As you've probably heard, that is the last part of the brain to develop. And it's the part of your brain that basically tells you not to do stupid things like get addicted. So looking at ER records in the United States, you'll notice here are just ER records for all children, and here are ER records for suicidal ideation over the last 10 years. You can see them going up. And outpatient visits tripled in this period of time. This just came out yesterday. It was in Journal of Pediatrics. And what we're looking at here is childhood self-poisonings, either 10 to 12-year-olds or 13 to 15-year-olds. And you'll notice that since 2007, the marked upswing, particularly in girls, in poisonings. And some of those poisonings, unfortunately, have been successful. Because here we have the change in death rates in the United States by year for children ages 10 to 14. And what you'll notice is that motor vehicle accidents have been cut in half, which is great, except that now suicides are actually more common than MVAs as a cause of childhood death. So a lot of those childhood poisonings are successful. And it's not just childhood, because here is the entire United States with suicide rates up 30%. Why is everyone killing themselves? What is so miserable that people are now taking their own lives? How does this happen? And as Patrick told you, antidepressant use is up in the United States and, in fact, all over the world. Because now the WHO says that 4.4% of the entire world's population is now clinically depressed. And that is an 18.5% increase in prevalence in just one decade. And that is not selection bias, that is not sampling bias, that is controlled for poverty and for race and for geography. This is a global health, public health problem. What is going on inside people's brains? Well, this is what's going on. This is the model. Over the last 50 years, here in black, this is what's happened to our society. Technology, processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, drugs. Those five. And those five share two things in common. Every single one of those five drive dopamine, drive the phenomenon of reward, drive the precursor to addiction. Now, pleasure is good, dopamine is good, reward is good, in small doses. The problem is chronic overstimulation of dopamine leads to downregulation of the dopamine receptor. That dopamine receptor is where the problem is. Because when that dopamine receptor goes down, now you need more and more to get less and less. Because there are fewer receptors, it's less likely that any dopamine molecule will find a receptor to bind to and initiate a reward signal. So the more pleasure you seek, the more miserable you get. Add some stress, which then disinhibits this even further because the prefrontal cortex is normally inhibiting that dopamine surge. And that's where you get addiction. On the other side, every single one of these five drives the phenomenon of metabolic syndrome, all those liver phenomena I showed you before. And when metabolic syndrome goes up, serotonin, which is the contentment neurotransmitter, the happiness neurotransmitter, goes down. Therefore, you feel unhappy. Then add stress, which lowers the receptor. Now you have fewer molecules and fewer receptors, and there's depression. So addiction and depression, both going up at the same rate, are two sides of the same coin being driven by the same societal, environmental phenomena which we have put on ourselves as a society, along with the stress of living in that society. This is not going away. Now, these pathways in the brain, you'll see, tell us what we need to do about it. So, the reward pathway, the dopamine pathway, starts here in an area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. That's where the dopamine cell bodies are. And it projects to two areas. The first, that nucleus accumbens, the reward center. So you basically transduce that phenomenon of reward. And also to this prefrontal cortex. And that's what normally tamps things down. So there's normally a negative feedback pathway. You get a reward, and then you say, okay, but slow down, I don't need more. The contentment pathway is a little different. It starts in this area called the dorsal raphe. That's where the serotonin cell bodies are. And it innervates the entire cortex, including the prefrontal cortex. And then lastly, this stress pathway that I mentioned. Prefrontal cortex normally tamps down on an area called the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of your brain. So when you walk down a deserted alleyway at 3 in the morning, whether there's someone there or not, and you have this feeling of fear or this feeling of dread, just because you're walking down it, even if there's no one there, that's your amygdala basically sounding off. But it's your prefrontal cortex that tells you, no, you've done this 100 times before, nothing to be afraid of, go ahead and keep walking. Okay? The hippocampus, that's where the memory of when you put your hand on a hot stove when you were 3 years old, that feeds into the amygdala also, basically telling you, I can handle this because I have a memory of when this didn't occur, that when it was not a problem. Okay? So you have these 3 areas of the brain basically conspiring to try to keep your angst in check. And then you have the fourth part here, the hypothalamus, which then tells the adrenal glands to make the hormone cortisol. Now, when the adrenals make cortisol, that cortisol tells the prefrontal cortex to go to sleep. So what you end up having here is a positive feedback pathway between stress, amygdala activation, and the disinhibiting of reward in order to drive addiction and depression. So, back to our title. You are being hacked right now. So what is the hack? I told you all this about health, I've told you all this about addiction, I've told you all this about depression, but something's happened in the last 50 years. What is that hack? And I would argue that this is the hack. The systematic confusion and conflation of these 2 terms, pleasure and happiness. I would argue that this is not by accident. I would argue that this has been industry-driven, very specifically willful, government-sanctioned, because there's money involved, very well orchestrated. It is a plot, not a conspiracy. I do not believe that industry actors got together in a smoke-filled room and said, let's see how we can perpetrate malice and malfeasance upon the British and American populations. I do not believe that. What I do believe is that everyone is out for market share. And so everyone is watching what everyone else is doing. And so they are adopting the same paradigms in order to capture their own market share, so that everyone ends up doing the same thing because it works. That's a plot, not a conspiracy. And it's engineered strictly for a profit motive. Here's an example. Back to Coca-Cola. Did you have this campaign here in the UK, Open Happiness? So my question to you, any happiness in that bottle? Yes or no? Caffeine, dopamine. Sugar, dopamine. Phosphoric acid, that actually causes osteoporosis. Salt, not addiction, habituation. And carbonated water. Anything else in there? Am I missing anything? Any happiness in that bottle? Anything that drives serotonin? This was the longest running campaign in the company's history. 10 years it ran, 2005 to 2015. Why so long? Because it worked. That's why. If it didn't work, they wouldn't have been doing it. How about the Happy Meal? You have Happy Meals here in the UK? I think you do, right? Okay. So 1.5 billion toys, in San Francisco, we actually passed an ordinance that you had to dissociate the toy from the Happy Meal because the toy was coercion. So you could buy the toy for 10 cents, but it couldn't be part of the Happy Meal itself. So you know what happened after we instituted our toy ban? 3 states banned toy bans. Think about that. How about happy hour? It's 5 o'clock somewhere. You know where it's 5 o'clock every day? It's 5 o'clock at 10 o'clock on NBC in America, where Hoda and Kathy Lee have the Today Show Happy Hour, and they drink on camera. And this is particularly egregious because Hoda has breast cancer. And alcohol is a known driver of breast cancer promotion. How about stress? Do you have this campaign here in The UK for Cialis? Yes, no? No? You are so lucky. How about a little more stress? It's funny, it's funny. All right, well. So I'm almost done. So the last question, remember we said, what are the relationship between addiction, depression, and health? I hope I've answered that. What is the difference between pleasure and happiness? I hope I've answered that. And now what's the difference between marketing and propaganda? Anybody? What is the difference between marketing and propaganda? Some people say none. That's not true. There is a difference. Marketing is using information to espouse your point of view. Propaganda is using disinformation to espouse your point of view. So when a company tells the truth about their product, they're marketing, and they're allowed to. But when a company tells disinformation about their product, knowing disinformation about their product, that's propaganda. The problem is they're also allowed to. Because, at least in America, commercial speech is free speech. The difference is the truth. The commonality is dopamine. They're both designed to get your dopamine flowing. And that is true whether it's about a product or whether it's about a political campaign. In fact, this is exactly what happened with Brexit. Because people who were targeted with specific disinformation raised their dopamine to the point where they went out and voted leave. This is a well-established new political campaign. So here we are. Addiction, depression, health going down the tubes. What can you do? What can we do? Well, turns out there are some things you can do right now, this minute, all of you. And I call them the 4 C's. They are all evidence-based and clinically proven to up your serotonin to improve happiness, tamp down your dopamine to reduce reward and addiction, tamp down your cortisol to reduce stress. Sounds like a good cocktail, right? And better yet, totally money-back guarantee. You ready? Money-back guarantee. But none of them cost anything, so no refunds. And these are all 4 things, all 4 C's are 4 things your mother told you that you actually grew up with, but you forgot while you were texting your friend and drinking a Coca-Cola. Here are the 4 C's. Number 1, connect. And this does not mean Facebook. This means face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection, like we are doing right now. How come? How come you can't do this over a typewriter? How come you can't do this over a computer screen? How come it has to be in your face? There's a reason. The reason is because we have a set of neurons in the back of our head, in our occipital lobe. You can record from them. They're called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. These mirror neurons are transducing information that you get from the person you are talking to because you are reading their facial expressions in real time. And you are adopting those expressions and transducing those emotions into your own. And we have a name for this process. It's called empathy. And if you do it, you are empathic. And if you can't do it, you are psychopathic. That is the definition of psychopathy, is the inability to transduce facial expressions. And we know this because this is how we communicated before there was language. Paul Ehrlich, famous psychologist, evolutionary biologist from UC Berkeley, who I actually had the opportunity to have lunch with just a month ago. Brilliant guy. He's 87 years old, still sharp as a tack. He went to Papua New Guinea in 1968. Never saw a white person. And these people had the exact same facial expressions for the same emotions that we do. It's baked into our DNA because this is how we communicated before we had language. And we are reading those facial expressions on the fly. And we are changing our emotions and our behavior and generating a serotonin response. So the question is, can you do that online? And the answer is, nope, you cannot. So people who abdicate conversation for online communication are basically shortchanging themselves in a big way. They're driving their dopamine, but they are absolutely losing their serotonin. I'll give you an example of how this works. Religion. Okay? I don't care if you're religious or not, irrelevant to me. There are 4,200 religions on the planet. 4,200. They all share one thing in common. What is it? Every religion has one thing that every other religion has too. A meeting place for social cohesion. A meeting place. Every religion has a meeting place. And that's because that's where the serotonin gets done. Now, once the pastor or the rabbi or the imam starts talking, that's the dopamine. Okay? So it can go both ways. All right, but the bottom line is the reason for the meeting place is the social cohesion, is the serotonin. The problem is social media generates dopamine only. And Facebook use leads to social isolation and depression. So my colleague Sherry Turkle, an MIT media watcher, was the one who coined the term alone together. And alone together is a very miserable place to be. Second C, contribute. And that does not mean to your retirement. That means outside of yourself, to the rest of the world, to the greater good, to people less fortunate than you. And it does not occur necessarily through money. It might, but not usually. Padding your bank account does not generate serotonin. And those who are financially successful actually derive less contentment from their financial success. And spending money actually drives dopamine. It doesn't do a thing for serotonin. Saving money drives serotonin. The question people always ask is, can you derive happiness from your work? And the answer is yes, you can, with two provisos. Number one, you can see how your work helps others. And number two, your boss can see it too. If both of those are satisfied, you can derive serotonin and happiness and pleasure and reward and contentment from your work. If not, then there's altruism, volunteerism, philanthropy, anything that contributes to the greater good. But this is outside of your self-contribution. Number three, cope. And by cope, I mean three things: sleep, mindfulness, exercise. So sleep deprivation is an enormous problem. 35% of Americans now get less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and 23% are clinical insomniacs. And the problem is, when you don't get enough sleep, you generate a ghrelin response, which generates food, which generates dopamine, but you actually depress serotonin. So you end up eating for the pleasure and to stay awake, and you actually down your dopamine. Plus, caffeine drives dopamine in an attempt to try to stay awake, but it doesn't do a thing for your serotonin. The second problem is called multitasking. This is the buzzword to get a job nowadays. If you can't multitask, you can't have a job. Problem is, only 2.5% of human beings can actually multitask. The other 97.5% are serially unitasking. Okay? They're just getting away with it. The problem is, every time you switch from one task to another, you get a cortisol bump and you lose 23 minutes of functional concentration time. So how effective do you think you will be multitasking? All you will do is make yourself miserable. Plus, screens are the antithesis of sleep, in part because of the blue light, which tells your brain the lights are still on. In addition, of course, the content on those blue screens. Smartphones have not, those apps for wellness have not demonstrated any benefit thus far. 27,000 smartphone apps for wellness, and none of them work. Yet. That doesn't mean they will never work, but none of them work yet. And the reason is because they all supply data, not information. Information is data you can use, and it's personalized data for you specifically. And none of them are there yet. Mindfulness is exercise for the prefrontal cortex. Basically focusing on one thing or nothing actually tamps down dopamine, heightens serotonin. As soon as you have two things, you're screwed. And it turns out exercise is as good as SSRIs at alleviating depression. And if you combine mindfulness plus exercise, you can reverse the need for any SSRI for depression. You can reverse depression with those two maneuvers, neither of which require any drugs. And number four, our next president, cook. Since this is food for the brain, we got to talk about cook. There are three things in food that matter. Three. Okay? You need to remember these three. Number one, tryptophan. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin. It is the rarest amino acid. You actually have to look for it. It is in eggs, chicken, fish. Not exactly processed food. Processed food is pretty low in tryptophan. In addition, only 1% of the tryptophan that you consume actually gets to the brain. And there's an amino acid transporter in the brain to get that tryptophan across to be able to convert it to serotonin, but it is competed with by phenylalanine and tyrosine, which are high in processed food. So the more processed food, the less chance, like taxi cabs on New Year's Eve, the less chance you'll be able to find one that's available to transport it across. So eating processed food deprives you of the thing you need and actually occupies the receptors, so you make sure you don't get what you need. Oh, sorry. The second thing, omega-3 fatty acids, which Dr. Crawford is going to talk with you at great length about. Turns out omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and that has a very important role in neurotransmission, particularly around serotonin boutons. So if you look at omega-3 deficient rats or mice, they have an inflammatory haze around their serotonin synaptic boutons. They can't transduce that effect. You give them the omega-3s, it goes away. Things get better. And it's been shown that omega-3s make you feel better. Having said that, there was just an article in JAMA that showed that omega-3 supplementation alone does not alleviate depression. So there are still some questions about that. That paper just came out 2 days ago. The problem is, and then the third thing is, of course, sugar, because sugar lowers serotonin, ups dopamine. So basically what we want is we want a low sugar, high tryptophan, high omega-3 diet. You know what that's called? It's called real food. What we have instead is a high sugar, low tryptophan, low omega-3 diet. That's called processed food. Processed food kills, real food works. But processed food is cheap. And processed food is government subsidized. The question is your government losing more from the food or from the healthcare? Which is it? You have to vote. And you have to vote based on this. And when you answer your question, which is more important, your food or your healthcare, then that's when the NHS will get better, and that's when Britain will get better, and not 1 minute sooner. The real food movement is in high gear. Companies that don't change will be left in the dust. Problem is the big companies are chewing up the startups specifically to kill them. Now, the good news is Nestle, Unilever, Mars, and Danone have agreed to a public letter committing to change on this issue. My last parting words to all of you are, make a meal and share it with your family. Because when you do that, you are connecting, you are contributing, you are coping, and you are cooking all at once. Making a meal and sharing it with your family, and I'm not talking about Thanksgiving, that's a different story, is the single best thing you can do for your health, for your mental health, and for the mental health of everyone around you. And that is food for the brain. With that, I want to thank you, and I will be here all day to answer all of your questions. Thank you.